Welcome to DAO Deep Dives, where we interview DAO founders, core DAO contributors, and everyone else who works on the periphery of decentralized autonomous organizations.
Welcome, Matty. Today it's just the two of us. Solve is out gallivanting around somewhere else on the internet, not sure. But we are getting into tokenomics for DAOs, I think, primarily here, but also talk a little bit about what else you're up to. Hey, Matty, how's it going?
Pretty good, thank you. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, let's dive right in. So, couple of easy questions in the beginning. You are anon, I guess we call it, for the first time on DAO Deep Dives. Everyone else has doxed themselves or has been doxed before, but of course we are in crypto, so we totally understand. So I'll leave it up to you how you want to answer that first question. But who are you?
Good question. Maybe I'll just give a bit of my background as an answer to that. I, like many people in crypto, I started my professional career in traditional finance. So I worked in algorithmic trading, hedge fund role. And for years, I discovered Bitcoin or found Bitcoin in 2015, was there in Ethereum through the ICO craze of 2017. But that was totally in parallel, this other world distinct from my professional career. And so my professional career started in finance, moved from algorithmic trading into machine learning. I have some Web 2 founding experience, starting companies, raising VC funds, et cetera. But then I would say a few years ago at this point, the tracks of on the side learning about and investing in crypto and my professional career combined when I was informally working with communities, using my skill sets in modeling in finance to understand these concepts, doing informal work for DAOs and DeFi protocols and that sort of stuff. And the Stacks Foundation, Stacks being a top 50 project, a layer 2 for Bitcoin, reached out and said, hey, do you want to do this in a more formal capacity? And so I joined the Stacks Foundation as a resident focused on tokenomics. And then more recently have joined Status and their entity Logos in a full-time capacity, leading their tokenomics team. So that's a bit, without getting too exact or precise, that's a bit about myself.
Yeah, very cool. So the standard question we ask all of our guests, always right up front, and feel free to answer it however you want to answer it, which is simply, what is a DAO?
What is a DAO? It is something that claims to be decentralized, but 99% of the time isn't. I feel like there's two ways to answer that. There's the theoretical, right, the ideal that we're moving towards, and then there's the modern implementation of that ideal. In premise, I think, and I guess this will give away a bit more about my background. I used to work for Bridgewater Associates, Ray Dalio's hedge fund, the guy who wrote like the principles, and a lot of people know him from that. And I think that's the reference I came to DAOs from, was thinking of, okay, here's this hedge fund where the founder is literally trying to retire and automate himself out of the job. And because a lot of companies, especially hedge funds and asset management companies, but also startups, they drastically change and die after the founder leaves. Think about Apple without Steve Jobs, that type of dynamic. And so a lot of times these people are trying to take this magic that they brought and automate it and have it live on as systemized rules, as implementations of automated kind of decision making. And I think that is the lens that I view DAOs as. These organizations, these groups of people, they can be nonprofit, profit, they can be any loose collective of people with any real objective or agenda, but focused on there being no kind of central founder leader, right? Or these ethos that may have been inspired by some central founder leader, but they're no longer involved or they're no running the show, right? And it's the culture and these set of rules, increasingly more automated rules, but I think there will always be room for some kind of human involvement, right? A distributed kind of governance type of involvement that runs the show, that determines what happens, right? That changes the automated rules if the logic needs to be improved, that sort of thing. So it's a new way of approaching. I would say it's a new structure for humans to organize themselves in. Essentially, is the core principle at play.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the shout out there to Ray. When I read his book recently in the last couple of years, I could not help but draw the parallels to DAOs and the crypto part everywhere.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm biased. I live in the space. But The one example I keep bringing up, I think we mentioned it a bunch of times on this show already, is his baseball card analogy he uses, right, in his companies, and how perfect of a use case that for NFTs is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, it definitely requires a certain type of person, right, to be okay with that. But you could potentially do, in Bridgewater, it's a baseball card of your strengths and your weaknesses, right? And everyone literally has a rating of these different characteristics. But yeah, you could definitely see an analogy even without the criticisms or the weaknesses of just reputation, right? Things, right? Oh, this person is good or has done well previously at this thing, and they have this NFT that tracks your reputation. So I think that's one of the struggles with identifying DAOs, is that there's so many different shapes and implementations and ways they can be come to life, really. But yeah, that's definitely one aspect that reminds me.
Yeah, I keep throwing this out there. Selfish hope of mine is that some listeners, we're a small podcast still, right? But that some listeners eventually pick up some of these ideas we're throwing around here and just start building.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
certainly reputation is an area not solved properly yet, in my humble opinion.
yeah.
Yeah, cool. So we know each other from DAO we were in together, Constellation DAO. And besides that, and besides all of the things you just mentioned, you're clearly involved in a lot of cool initiatives. One of which you touched on very briefly, Logos. I want to dive into that just for a second. We had a couple of network state-ish type projects on the show before. Build Cities, Catawba, the Catawba Digital Economics Zone, I should say. So network states, very interesting, very hot topic these days. And as far as I understand, in a nutshell, Logos builds critical infrastructure for network states. Is that correct?
Yes, Logos is really a set of infrastructure projects that is coming out of Status or Status. Listeners, longtime listeners may remember one of the earliest Ethereum projects, early 2017 ICO, decentralized messaging protocol. The vision has expanded of messaging is just one piece really of what it would require to have a, credibly politically neutral kind of decentralized network states. You have the messaging relaunching soon as a native Web3 Discord, token gating, all that sort of stuff, which I think people have been talking about. This is needed, and Discord is so antithetical to some the ideals of crypto, but it's still the number one used tool. So that's one piece of it. But then there's a number of other pieces. You need a way to store history, right? That can't be altered or censored. You need a base layer of understanding truth and consensus. So there's a number of really key infrastructure protocols optimizing for, and it's not, I think it's important to distinguish that really what it's optimizing for is not a technical requirement, right? It's optimizing for political neutrality, for censorship resistance, for these sorts of things that you could design similar products, and similar products exist that don't maximize or go out of their way to optimize these attributes. But in order to empower something like a network state, to have network states, which, let's be honest, will have some level of adversarial attack from existing powers that be, it seems very naive to think that there won't be some kind of resistance to this. Then it needs to, in our opinion at least, have this optimized for this, right? Maximize this political neutrality, this censorship resistance, and all the technical requirements that go with that, and also the economic and requirements that go with that. And that's more the side I'm focused on, the token economics team.
Yeah, very cool space. You recently wrote a tokenomics guide for builders,
Yep.
which is a amazing resource. First of all, thanks for doing this. And so before we get into the nitty gritty of that topic, how did that come to be? Like, how did you set out to write this? Because it's a free resource. We will link to this in the show notes for everyone. You should check it out. It's accompanied with videos and everything. Fantastic. So how did that happen?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, and it's open source resource out there for everyone. It took, I think, something like a year and a half. I was working on it, not working on it full time, obviously, but to finish it. It came about. I speak to a lot of builders. Obviously, I had just spoken to a cohort at a Web3 accelerator that had graduated, and Not all the teams were necessarily launching a token, but they were all token curious, at least I should say, right? I noticed a lot of teams, especially when they start fundraising, suddenly they ask more questions about, oh, maybe we need a token. A lot of these teams, or pretty much all of these teams, were going through the same exact questions, right? Like, how do we, there wasn't even a clearly defined framework for how they think about the incentives at play, the use cases, what kinds of utilities, what are the options to even choose between. And then, of course, all the more standard stuff of the supply side. What percentage should we give to the team versus investors? How long should it vest for? All these questions, right? There's so many questions on the supply side, on the emissions, on the incentives, on the utility, on the demand. And so that was when I thought, okay, these builders need a comprehensive guide, not reading 7 different textbooks on game theory and then macroeconomics and then finance. And that they need just one guide that maybe isn't as deep, or by definition can't be as deep as explaining every intricate detail of the math and game theory, for example, behind which consensus mechanisms use, but at least talks about all the questions you need to think through, maps out a step-by-step process to design your token, links to the other resources, chock full of citations, the best Twitter threads out there, the best blogs, best YouTube videos, that sort of stuff. So that was the thought process. And then it just kept getting bigger and bigger as I was creating it, because there were so many, so it's such a big problem area, so many unknowns. So it got a bigger scope than I initially imagined, but I'm very pleased with the feedback I'm getting having launched it.
So you're writing a guide, which, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but which I would say will teach you how to think about all of these steps in relation to your context of your DAO or whatever project you might have, and gives you all of these resources and comparisons. One chapter is comps, right?
Yep.
To really develop an understanding of what are best practices, what have other people done, what have other people done that might have not worked so well, right? Like the history. You mentioned also the 5 steps to launching a token, which the tokenomic design is merely step 1 for this, right? So you have the tokenomic audit, smart contract development, smart contract audit, and then the actual launch event. So are we expecting chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5?
I don't think so. Those, like, as you said, there's so many elements, and I don't think I never present myself as I'm an expert in tokenomics, right? Or I'm an expert in every subfield, right? I don't think anyone can credibly claim that, and I think everyone should be very skeptical of people or anyone who says I'm a tokenomics expert, right? Quote unquote. There's no way you can be an expert at game theory, an expert at finance, an expert at fundraising, an expert at marketing, all these different pieces that go into it. This is, again, meant to be, there's not like one size fits all for this is the best approach or this is the best tokenomics model to implement, but it is a framework, it is a lens at which to design it in a more intentional way. And yeah, I liked your point about the projects that failed arguably teach you more than the projects that have worked, right? Because projects that work oftentimes are very contextually dependent. It works in that context. But projects that fail oftentimes teach more universal lessons, like US Terra, for example. Like, you can't, it's only a matter of time if you have your liabilities mismatch your assets, right? Or your income before that becomes some kind of bank run happens and then it melts down. So I think we've learned that lesson painfully about all sorts of under collateralized stable coins where largely no one is even doing that. Frax pivoted away from that after Terra. So that's one example of a more universal lesson, but there is no such thing as like the best tokenomics model, certainly.
Yeah, quick shout out here to Reserve Protocol, which was episode 17, and that was a big topic. They are a stablecoin launchpad, I want to say, right? And we talked about exogenous and endogenous collateralization of stablecoins, and Luna, of course, always a good poster child.
Yeah, it's tough.
So let's start simple. We're already throwing a lot of terms around here, but for the listeners who might still be in the beginning of that journey with DAOs and tokens and all of that jazz, what are tokenomics and why do they matter for DAOs?
Yeah, I think when people hear the word tokenomics, they too often think of, oh, the pie chart with the percentage for the team and the percentage for everyone, and then the graph of emissions over time, and that's tokenomics, right? No, that's just one small subset, right? That's supply aspects, not even all the supply aspects of your tokenomics. To me, tokenomics is a set of policies or a set of rules, monetary or non-monetary, right, governance that coordinate user behavior, create incentives to coordinate user behavior towards an intended goal. So you can think of it if you're coming from an economics lens, right, or economic lens, right? In economics, it's more like describing the outcome, trying to make sense of what happened, right? Like why is inflation so high? Whereas in tokenomics, it's more designing for a specific goal, right? For example, Bitcoin, some of the simplest but original tokenomics, we can optimize for retaining purchasing power by limiting the max supply, right? So that's just one simple example. But to me, it's about incentives and coordinating user behavior.
Right. So if you had to, again, a lot of these questions, bear with us as you're listening. There isn't necessarily a one answer fits all, right? But
Yep.
when I ask why does this matter to DAOs, right? Of course, you
Hmm.
cannot give a comprehensive answer, but generally speaking, if someone is in the early stages of thinking about starting a DAO, or if there's a small community that they are thinking about, oh, maybe we are becoming a DAO, and there might be a token model they have in mind,
Yep.
why should they be thinking about maybe following a guide like yours to wrap their head around how to think about tokenomics?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the shortest answer I can give is that even a great product or community can be severely damaged, if not entirely killed off, by poorly designed tokenomics. And so if you're thinking of launching a token, it is very important to actually sit down and think through and not just blindly copy something that worked in some other context and then paste it into your context and assume it'll work the same way. Because poorly designed tokenomics, mismatched tokenomics, incentives that are misaligned can and have killed communities before. So that's really the shortest answer. It's getting longer, I guess, on the benefit side. The right tokenomics can help you accelerate your growth, right? Attract more people, align incentives, get people engaged, potentially make it easier to raise investment. Benefits like that. Obviously, those need to be well balanced, right? There's many cases where Web3 gaming, play to earn, Axie Infinity, right? They accelerated the growth of their player base by all these hyperinflationary token emissions, but they didn't really balance that and then ended up crashing as a result, right? There still needs to be well-designed approach, even though there are some benefits associated with launching a token. And I think in general, DAOs sometimes make the mistake of launching a transferable, tradable, fungible token too early, where something more like what we were talking about, like a non-tradable reputation token, whether that's fungible, whether that's a fungible token balance or an NFT, right, badges type of thing, is oftentimes much better at maximizing that kind of engagement and community involvement factor without introducing the speculation and monetary kind of abuses and exploits that can come if the token suddenly is tradable and has a value. And you do that too early before there's really a sustainable kind of engine to the DAO itself.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super important to remember that DAOs, crypto projects, whatever it might be, at the end of the day, the fundamentals haven't changed, right? You still need to have utility. You still need to
Yep.
create value for your
Yep.
customers, for your members, whatever it might be. And ultimately, that's how I like to think about it, at least. Your tokens or whatever assets power kind of the internal mechanics, they should be reflecting that, right? I think that's a super simple way to think about it. One of the questions is, do we need a token? You
Yeah.
said
Great
earlier,
question. There's a
are we
whole chapter in the
fundraising?
guide about that. Yeah.
Just because you need money, maybe a token launch shouldn't be the first thing to think about, right? If that
Yeah.
token has nothing else to do in your product, then yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
um,
definitely a mistake is launching a token purely for fundraising. And then quickly, another mistake that people make is assuming that, oh, I'll launch this token, but I'll just give it away for free. And so no one can, it'll be fine because I'm just giving it away for free. But even then, like You're in Finance did this, for example, even then founders regretted it afterwards. People complain, right? Like when this feature going to be rolled out, why is the price going down? So even airdropping or giving tokens away for free can create headaches, distractions, right? More problems than benefits most of the time.
yeah, certainly, and even on a smaller level, right? Even if it's not a tradable token, even if there is no financial aspect to it. We've seen this in DAOs. I personally experienced it a couple of times actually, where maybe for the newness of everything, right? Launched a couple of years ago, and we're like, oh, we need a governance token, and then everyone just gets like a certain amount, and then a year later, the community is still trying to find their identity.
Yeah.
And then oftentimes I found that it's already too complicated. The governance is already too complicated. People who have been there day one, because of course, like we've seen this over the last 3 years. Oh, token launch event, let me just grab some tokens, right? Like they have no clue what this community is about. They don't give a shit, frankly. And then you have all of these tokens out there in the wild, and you can't get to any votes anymore because no one's engaged.
Yeah. And like most of the governance is about determining how governance itself should work. It's not about anything actually meaningful or tangible. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, yeah, it's tough to, I think a lot of DAOs, especially because of what they are, decentralized being in the name, they try to run before they walk. They try to go for this pure objective of we're going to be decentralized. But think about how like trust and reputation and these sort of things work, right? It's inherently this transitive thing, right? Like I trust you and you trust me, and you have this friend, and because I trust you and you trust him, I trust him as well. And so when you try to ignore that and just go straight to everyone has this reputation token and equal vote or token weighted voting, you're ignoring that versus first taking this arguably much more centralized, much more non-scalable approach to seed the reputation or the token. But that, in my opinion, more accurately, more precisely mimics how trust in communities and organizations actually works in reality, and therefore has a much higher chance of leading to a successful entity that may eventually become decentralized, right? So I think there's a little bit of a walk before you run aspect, or in Web 2 startup nomenclature, right? Sometimes you have to do things that don't scale in order to reach eventually scaling.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's hard to do, right? Because you do lose yourself in all of these governance questions.
Yeah.
Because you want to, I am specifically burdened with this as an engineer. Like you think about, I always over-engineer things, or I have a tendency to do that.
Yeah.
You're like, we need to design the perfect system, but that doesn't exist. Certainly not in the early days of a DAO. Like we don't even know what the fuck we're doing yet, right? Because it's not, that's the big difference between a regular startup maybe and a community, be it a DAO or not. It's not just your opinion, right? Or you and a couple of co-founders. That might be true in the first couple of, days, months, weeks, whatever it is. Yeah. But ultimately, the community will drive where it's going. And if you can't build community, then it's not going anywhere. So maybe also a word of advice, right? Maybe you don't need to be a DAO. Maybe you want to be a startup. If you want to decide everything, and that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that, I think. Yep. But yeah, it's cool, shiny object, squirrel, right? A new DAO. But yeah, be careful with that.
Related to that, or maybe perhaps a manifestation of that, right? As you see protocols like Rush to have token-based user governance. And or at least one of the chapters in the guide touches on, there's so many actual drawbacks and weaknesses to using token-based governance, right? Especially if that token is tradable, right? Because you're basically introducing the potential for a well-funded player to launch some kind of exploit on the protocol or the DAO. And if you have a treasury, you're basically just exposing your treasury to exploit attacks. So I think builders too often gloss over all the downsides and trade-offs to user governance and just rush into it because they think it's a must. Perhaps they think it's reducing their regulatory risk, but oftentimes that's not even the case. And they're rushing into it for really not much good reason.
Yeah, very true. So I thought what would be fun, and let me know if you think we can do this,
okay,
is to walk through, on very high level, of course, through your guide and 7 or so chapters or cornerstones of how to think about tokenomics on an actual example. So we have the fundamentals, objects and requirements, value accrual, lifecycle patterns, incentive mechanisms, supply policy, modeling and optimization, and legal structure or legal opinion and structure as that kind of some of the core chapters in the guide. Yeah. And rather than talking through them, because of course every listener who is really interested in this should go and actually read it and watch your videos, who are a lot more comprehensive than what we can cover in the next 30 minutes. But I thought it would be a fun exercise to pick an example and then just get your kind of guidance a little bit on that example as we would think through this very high level. Do you think that's doable?
Yeah, sounds good.
So I called it Off-Grid DAO,
Okay.
and it's inspired by things like City DAO, Cabin, Cougar DAO even. And the core idea is a network of land, off-grid land, that doesn't have to be off-grid necessarily, right? That's just the spark of the idea, was to have maybe like a 50 parcel network all across the United States. A network of shared land in desirable places, ideally, of course, owned and managed by a DAO.
Nice.
And then very quickly you get into having to deal with, first of all, real world assets, which is a big thing, how we buy it, how we pay taxes on it, and all of that stuff.
I think that's an important aspect for sure.
But to do that, right? Like, it seems like a token-based system could make sense, like owning this kind of stuff on chain, kind of collaboratively. So, yeah, I'll just let it stand there for a second and have you guide me through thinking through this.
Yeah, this is a good example. Appreciate it. And we're just going through this live cold. So this will be a fun exercise. So I guess the first aspect of it is to consider, as you said, this first step is the objectives and the requirements for the product, but also the community in this case, but also for the token. And so you would think through, in this case, there is going to be, like you said, this real world asset element. And so that probably means that inherently there's going to be some degree of centralization, right? No matter what, because some entity or someone or something is going to have to own the deed to that land, right? And that the government can always come along and say, hey, we're tearing up this deed or we're taking this land, right? There is just inherently always a degree of centralization risk to anything that is real world asset related. And so I think it would be important in the first step for the members of the community before launching a token to get on the same page about what would success for this project look like, right? What are our objectives and what are the relative trade-offs we're willing to make with these ideals about decentralization and centralization risk? Perhaps in this case, it's okay to have this legal entity like a DAO or an LLC own the land, but then the tokens represent shares of that LLC, so they can very easily be traded around, transferred, right, used in governments on chain, and avoiding all these inefficiencies and costs of the legacy system, because it's shockingly difficult to actually trade shares or LLC shares of a private membership, LLC type of entities. So the first thing would be get on the same page about what are we even trying to do? What are some of the trade-offs? The second thing at high level to focus on would be value accrual. So basically, what value does the product create for people? In this case, I would presume it's access to this community or access to this land, right? For holiday purposes, whatever. Maybe you can use it for some new Burning Man type of event. So there's some kind of value the product creates, right? And then how does that value, some portion of that value essentially get captured by the protocol or the DAO treasury in this case, right? So maybe that's you have to pay dues or you have to pay fees based on how often you use the land, right? Or something like that. And then that translates into how does that portion that's being captured by the protocol or the treasury get into the token, right? Or like in brief terms, like why does the token matter? Like how does it have value? Why do people even want it? Maybe it's as simple as there's no direct value accrual, but the token is worth it because you need to be a token holder to get into this community. Maybe it's a token gated community, right? So that could be one mechanism that's very clear. This token has value because this is a desirable thing to have access to this land, and this token is the thing that gives me access to this land. And maybe the number of tokens you hold increases the amount of time you can reserve the space for, right? So there's this relationship between the token and the value associated with it. Figuring out the life cycle patterns for the token would be roughly the next thing. So by life cycle patterns, how is the token created? Is it all created one time? Is there some kind of reward or emissions over time? Do people mine it, farm it, right? What are the sources of new tokens being created? Is it transferable, right? Is it this, in this case, probably is going to be a transferable token, not a soul-bound token, right? But that's an important distinction to make. How is it used? How is it destroyed? People always think of burning, but there's other ways, like a token might actually expire over time. VE curve is essentially, right, a token that decays over time. So there's actually different ways that the tokens might be destroyed or decay. Then my personally favorite part, you get into the incentive mechanisms. In this case, it's a bit less clear to me what the different roles involved would be, but take like a DeFi protocol, like an AMM, right? There's going to be like liquidity providers and traders. Those are fundamentally different roles. Yes, you or I, as one person, might at different times play both of those roles, but when we're playing each role, we have very different objectives for that role, right? As a liquidity provider, I want to make a passive return and not get a permanent loss. And as a trader, I want to pay less slippage, et cetera. And so you need to think through these different parties. What what behaviors do we want them to do? What behaviors do we want them to not do or abstain from? And then how do we incentivize each of those different roles to do those things? And then where are their conflicts, right? So in this example, maybe there's a role of people who maintain the property, right? Who
Yep.
are stewards of the property. And then there's people who come to use it. And an obvious thing to incentivize the stewards is to reward them, right? Some basic salary for doing this because they're working, but all else equal, right? That conflicts with the people who want to use it. They don't want to pay too much, right? So you have potentially an incentive mechanism conflict there. You have perhaps that people who come, you don't want them to just trash the place, right? And so maybe an incentive to avoid them trashing the place is that they have to stake some kind of collateral to come, and a steward or stewards as a consensus can say, hey, Matty, last time you came, you're an asshole. You didn't clean up after yourself. So we're slashing 20% of your collateral, right? So these are all examples of incentives that may or may not be relevant. But the thing is to figure out how do you get people to do what you want and get them to not do what you don't want them to do, and then balance those, because sometimes between different roles, those will be in direct conflict. And so that helps you identify, oh, we then need to optimize, right? What is the right balance of slashing rates and collateral? Or what is the right balance, again, in the AMM example, of fees that traders are happy with it and LPs are happy with it? So moving on to supply policy, that's all the questions that people generally think about when they think of tokenomics, right? The allocation, the emissions, the vesting length. One thing I think people focus on too much is, or do too much of, is just like linear vesting, when non-linear shapes maybe make more sense. The trouble with linear emissions is that you have the highest rate of inflation upfront because you have a constant number of tokens being emitted. But when the protocol just launches, there's the least amount of tokens out there. So in terms of percentage growth of the base, the inflation rate or the dilution rate, it's very lumpy and very high when you have linear emissions, whereas nonlinear emissions can have different number of tokens being emitted, but actually have a more flat percentage rate of inflation over the course of the project. So there's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of best practices in the guide about that. Sometimes they're case specific, but supply policy. And then once you've figured out the supply policy and you've figured out these incentives that you need to optimize and balance, then you start doing some more quantitative modeling, right? So we've done like qualitative analysis of the incentives up to this point. We then do more quantitative optimization and modeling, whether that's in Excel, deterministic models, or in Python or other tools to do stochastic or agent-based modeling, and also maybe do some economic security analysis that maybe is not relevant to this case. But again, in a DeFi context, the Mango markets exploit wasn't really a bug in the code, but it was more an economic vulnerability. Someone could drive up, manipulate the market, and then mint too much, borrow against the protocol, leave it. So there are economic vulnerabilities. So there's a framework for thinking through the security from an economic lens, not just a code lens. And then the final step is thinking through the legal opinion, legal structure. I'm not a lawyer, and the guide doesn't pontificate or speculate on, give you legal advice. It just links to the resources from other professional lawyers, people who work in crypto, legal counsel for some of the leading DAOs and DeFi protocols out there, and advice. So there's all sorts of, you can do structures in the Caymans and Singapore and Dubai, right, in the States. And so there's advice all there for how you should actually set it up. And that's, and especially for the use case you just talked about, that's arguably like the most crucial part of it, right? Because you can't mess up the entity or the organization when it comes to anything that is RWA because or asset, because the government will be able to fine you, tax you, censor you, arrest you. So yeah, that was hopefully that was just a brief walkthrough
Yeah,
use case.
very cool. You can tell you spent a little while on this guide because it's top of mind, right?
And then there's a valid question of should we just do a classic timeshare type of structure? There are definitely benefits to efficiency and transfer of ownership, but perhaps a token doesn't make sense for this use case. And that's part of the objectives and requirements. There's a whole chapter titled, does every project need a token, in the guide for a reason? Because no, the short answer is no, but there's a framework for a checklist for kind of thinking through, is a token potentially a good match for your project? But then also, even if it is now the right time to launch a token, right, for your project, which are two different questions that people just combine them into one or don't even think about the second one too often, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. And so for this example, I could also see two different paths, right? So first of all, you could just use this structure to get together with like-minded people. Maybe you know each other already and you just want to buy a piece. Let's start with one piece, first of all, right? Not 50.
Yeah.
And you buy a piece of property on chain and get your feet wet, right? And maybe you just want to own it together and that's it. And you pro rata share your costs every year based on the token. Maybe it's just as simple as that instead of trying to over optimize this being a business, right? Maybe the question is not simply do you need a token, but before that, is this a business, or just if it has a business structure, it's a business. But maybe it's just a share between friends or maybe even people who don't know each other. And it could enable that. I think that's the power of permissionless and decentralized systems, that what you would have never otherwise done with people you didn't know, now you have a system that makes this autonomous, right? Like you have to just, how you enforce it is a different question, but you just have to pay your piece of the taxes. Maybe you'll just otherwise default back to the other members.
Yeah, maybe you forfeit your ownership shares, right? Like your tokens get slashed or something, right? In this context, yeah. But then again, you would want to talk to a lawyer to see if is it legal to just slash someone's ownership of something on chain of real world assets, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. So I think that's one of the risks that's obviously one of the strengths of tokens and smart contracts, right? Is that they are programmatically enforceable. You don't need to rely on, well, what if the judge interprets this law this way or that, right? The code is quote unquote law. I'm not a huge fan of that, but the code does what the code is written as, right? But unlike RWA, where if the cop is being an ass or some regulatory agency doesn't like you or some judge or jury decides something differently, you're at that mercy. So especially use cases like this, it's important to think through how each of those things, and especially the incentive mechanisms, will be enforced for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Drawing the parallels to regular good old corporate structures, what's most important, even if you're just yourself or you and your co-founder starting anything, is if you start with a simple structure like an LLC, your operating agreement needs to cover, at the very least, all of the high level what happens if shit hits the fan clauses, right?
Yep.
And that's what we're talking about here, because yes, we have new and frankly exciting ways to structure things like this. But if you buy a piece of property and unless someone knows this property and all of the local laws there exactly to a T and is the expert kind of participant, there will be, and even then there will be things you have not thought about, right?
Yeah, sure.
Almost 100% sure, like access roads, right? Just because there is a road doesn't mean it's a legal road. Yeah. Maybe you can never get to your land.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. But this is very helpful. I think hopefully this gives kind of like just a super high level, couple bullet point examples step by step for people how they would work through your guide. And what's very helpful, I believe, as well, is that with your guide comes the tokenomics design canvas.
Yes, that's essentially what we walked through. Yes, those 7 steps of the canvas.
And would you just say, like, people might be familiar with the startup canvas, or there's a couple of different ones out there? Is that how you think about it? Just it's like your somewhat visual tool to go through all of these steps with guiding questions and then just get them on paper and start seeing if they conflict anywhere.
Yeah. I think in general, like when you start to having to put things down somewhere, it forces you to just be much more structured in your thought, and you can start to see where things don't make sense and also communicate it much more easily to other people. Part of why I put this together was, I would speak to founders and they would just be all over the place. And oh, and we're going to have staking. Oh, and we're going to do this. And oh, and 10% is going to investors. What are you talking about right now? Yeah, I think a big benefit of it is to the builders themselves and communicating what they're thinking. Yeah, that's definitely a part of it.
Awesome. Yeah, I was expecting this to take hours. You got it down in 10 minutes. Very cool. I much appreciate you giving a brief overview on this. So let's get into a couple of more lighter-hearted ones as we approach the end of the episode here. There's a couple of standard questions long-term listeners will know. What we like to ask all of our guests who spend day in and day out thinking about crypto, Web3, DAOs, tokenomics, whatever it might be. This is DAO Deep Dive. So where are we going 10x, 100x from now with DAOs? What's the future look like in your mind?
It's a good question. I think with the rise of more advanced forms of AI, I think that becomes like a natural ally or tool for DAOs, because in theory at least, a lot of what DAOs do is just follow through on previously defined systemized rules that are now being followed and automated. And there's a lot of complexity in doing that, because first you need somebody, whether man or machine, to define the rule set, and then you need somebody to implement and actually follow along and abide by that rule set. And I can fix some of those problems, but I think there's also gaps in the enforceability on the blockchain side of things, right? Like, how many times are there governance votes where the governance vote still requires some human, oftentimes who holds like a multi-sig wallet, right, to say, oh, the user voted for this. Now I'm going to go and manually do this thing and then push it out there. And if they wanted to, or if they were coerced by a government or censored, they could just totally ignore that vote, right? Or just do nothing, or just rug everybody. And yes, you have this governance vote in theory, but it actually that's not the mechanism that enforces the change happening. So I think those are two big hurdles, like automating the following of the logic and then doing that on chain as well, and forcing it on chain, that I think will have to be overcome for DAOs really to scale up to these kind of like a truly autonomous decentralized entities that are being managed by token holders or community members who are tinkering with the rule sets, like the way a developer writes an algorithm today, right? They're not in the weeds manually executing the logic. That's the whole point of creating algorithm. They're tweaking the logic, the rule sets, the parameter values. I could see that type of dynamic. Imagine like a whole company running that way, or a whole nonprofit running that way. That's an amazing vision, but those hurdles in particular remain to be answered, I think.
Yeah, one example comes to mind. We had Oren McMillan from Gnosis on episode 18, I believe. And we talked about multi-sigs, of course, Safe, arguably one of the most popular multi-sigs today.
Yep.
And how I think most people, if you're just getting into the space, is exactly what you just described, right? To have a 3 of 5 or 5 of 8, whatever it might be, multi-sig. But at the end of the day, those people can still mess everything up, right? It's still just people in the back.
It's certainly better than one signature, but yeah, exactly. They can be lost, and there have been cases where it's been lost, or the team goes AWOL, and it's just not even malicious, but then you're just totally screwed.
Yeah, and in these early days of DAOs or these projects, usually people have their own lives, right? It's not just, they don't just all of a sudden do this full time. So there's delays in things, but what's interesting and what some people might not know, listen to episode 18, of course, for more detail. But what Gnosis and Safe have thought about very early on is to have that composability, right? And plugging in a module to your safe that now controls your safe. So you might start that way and just having a couple signers, but then you can also plug in your module or your colony module and control your safe directly through that, which I found super, super smart. And I haven't seen that utilized to the extent I feel like it should be utilized in these decentralized communities.
Yeah, there's some cool stuff with MPC, right? Multi-party computation stuff that is potentially enables these types of wallets to be more collectively owned or decentralized across the whole protocol. So at least in theory, they're more secure. And then you could do like permissions, like your multi-sig is permissioned to spend up to this amount of money on this thing on marketing every month, for example. And we can revoke access or grant access. So those toolings are coming. But yeah, I think they're definitely necessary critical infrastructure.
All right. So the other standard question, and I said earlier lighthearted. I guess I need to change that because where we're going in the future is not exactly a lighthearted question.
No.
But this one is my favorite though, and it really is just, again, because you spend so much time in this space. I'm sure you had an idea here and there where you thought, it's like, oh man, this should be a DAO. I wonder if someone's working on this. What's the craziest idea or use case you have thought about that should be a DAO, but you haven't seen implemented as a DAO yet?
That's a great question. I think network states, like I'm working on, is very ambitious. Like this, pretty ambitious already. But this is a cop out answer. I think going back to the original DAO, right? The DAO, which was basically a VC fund, right? For a decentralized VC fund, people contributed money to invest across projects. I think that I would love to see that type of structure become a big player that is competing alongside the names of A16Z and Paradigm, right? And these big guys. Maybe that's not the most like pie in the sky ambitious thing, but I think it's something that would go a long way to decentralizing access and would be, at least in theory, reachable in a medium term. Nouns DAO and things like that kind of approach that. But yeah, something that is decentralizing or distributing, democratizing, right, ownership and access to new forms of investment and capital. That is oftentimes what I spend my time thinking about.
I love this answer, of course. If you have listened to more than one episode, that Solve and I always love to talk about investment DAOs, a very big passion of ours. Obviously, we're in Constellation DAO together, which I think it's fair to say isn't an investment DAO yet, but has similar core principles we're trying to achieve at some point. But I tend to agree, I haven't seen that A16C competitor quite yet.
Yeah, or like maybe a Y Combinator competitor is a better target. But yeah, Constellation DAO is exciting to me because I think basically, right, Techstars alumni investment DAO or trying to become that. And I think that sort of context where you have, at least to start with, makes a ton of sense, right? Because you have people who are probably at least better informed or more experienced on average than just the general wide community. People who have founded companies before, raised money before. I think we have the pieces in the right place. It's just, the next steps are yet to be unlocked.
Yeah, actually, so that reminds me of one more question, which is, what do you think is holding a lot of these things back, especially in the current market, right? If it's a bull market, things are always a little bit more dynamic and exciting, and people tend to get involved a bit more. But do you think that a community like Constellation or others who are really early, are we just missing like that? What is it? Part 5, the incentives, right? Do we just need to think a bit more traditionally, and what is the business model, and how can we essentially pay our members for their efforts?
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, I think DAOs in general have a difficulty around incentive alignment because oftentimes you don't have a very strong relationship between the amount of time invested or the expertise or the value of the expertise someone brings to the table and their relative reward, even forgetting the dollar value of tokens, right? Just even their proportion of these tokens, which might even be worthless, right? That they're earning. So I think that's a tricky problem. It again harkens back to what I was talking about earlier. One reason perhaps why this more centralized, less distribution of the token of reputation from, oh, I know you're really bright about this, right? So I can vouch for you, instead of just trying to maximize decentralization right out of the gate, might make more sense, might help to align time invested in expertise or value created with actual token rewards so that people have those incentives aligned. But then also in general, I think we have a little bit of the tragedy of the commons, right? And you have this element, at least subjectively, I feel like DAOs, everyone wants to pontificate and share their opinion and talk about what could be. but then very few people actually want to go and do the dirty work of implementing it and raising money maybe to hire people who build right what has been set. Maybe the DAO governs the backlog, so to speak, and then there's a team that is more like employees or more akin to at least traditional employees actually executing that backlog. Yeah, I've definitely noticed that more seems to get done when instead of discussing things in the abstract with people, I just go and hammer out at least a first draft of something specific and then suggest a specific proposal, because it's much more easy for people to give feedback to a specific proposal than it is to just talk about this open-ended abstract problem all day long. You can just get stuck in that forever.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think a big downfall often is also that it's just like in any other startup, right? In the beginning, the first couple of weeks, everyone's gung ho. Is, oh my God, this is the best idea ever.
Yeah.
And then you realize, oh, we need to actually do the hard work to make this happen now.
Yeah.
And everyone is busy, right? Everyone
Right.
has another life already. And then finding that time and doing it.
Yeah, it's very difficult sometimes to find like sometimes it feels like pushing on a string, right? Like where can I actually make a difference? And I think that's perhaps a manifestation of the similar. Maybe we're talking about all that elephant analogy, right? Like all the blind people feeling the elephant. One feels the tail, one feels the leg. I feel like we're talking. All these are symptoms of this larger problem with DAOs that I don't know if we have the right terminology yet to describe it, but hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah, I think we will. It's early. I try to say this every now and then too. It is important to know that our industry is extremely young. It's hard to realize that sometimes if you're in it day in and day out, but patience is necessary. I do thoroughly believe in this future with DAOs. And with that, I think one of the last questions, is there anything in this realm which you would like to riff on for a minute, which we haven't touched on? We always try to give our guests a bit of a stage to talk about what they are most passionate about these days as well.
Yeah, I think I would love to see people. I know Griff Green, who people might remember from the DAO days, community manager there, led the white hat counter hack to recover, the exploited funds. And Griff and I were chatting about governance approaches the other day, and there's one thing he said about token weighted voting that really stuck with me and that I think about often. Is this really the best we can do? Right. I think it comes from, we're used to, at least in the West, these one person, one vote type of representative democracies, most votes win type of thing. But and just replace that with a token, right? One token, one vote. But is that really the best form of governance that can happen or that we can use? There's all kinds of other approaches, many of which are covered in the guide, right? Like pairwise voting and these sorts of approaches that help ranked choice voting, et cetera. People bubble up what is overall appealing to them. I think it's very prevalent looking at America's two-party system that the simple, just like A or B type of option, one token, one vote, pick this yes or no, doesn't always lead to the best overall outcome in the long run. So getting creative but pragmatic about approaches to governance is something I would put out there as a challenge to DAOs out there, because there's so much more design space, and just making sure that you're optimizing for what you're picking, the design that optimizes for your objectives makes sense. So
awesome. So if people have questions other than what we link to your guide you wrote, how do people get in touch with you if they have any questions or just want to geek out with you for a little bit?
I appreciate that. If you share the link to the guide, there is my contact information and like the about the author section of the guide. You can also find me on Twitter or Telegram. My handle in both places is just MattyTokenomics. So at MattyTokenomics works for either of those as well. My DMs are generally open. So yeah.
Amazing. We're already at an hour. I always wonder how fast this time goes by, but it's easy if you have amazing guests. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and we will see each other in the Constellation DAO at the very least.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Great chat.
Awesome. Thanks, Matty.
Cheers.
And that's a wrap. Sven and Solve are your host for DAO Deep Dives, a podcast about all things DAO. Thanks for tuning in. Till next time.